doing catch-up streams today to make up for the ones that I missed because my computer died. So I'm on my wife's computer. I don't have intros for you, so we're just going to launch right into the stream. And I'll be going through Chapter 11, and then later today I'll do Chapter 12, breaking them up for a couple other activities I got to take care of. So for those who are looking for updates for Book 3, it's done. I just stitched it together into what is going to be the sort of preliminary order of the plot, and then I have to go through it and make sure that what I need to tweak and change and fix and all that stuff. So it will change over time. I'm still hoping that it'll be ready by the spring, but there's no guarantees. Once I get through, once I get through the initial edit and have some people look at it, I'll be able to tell you a little better what needs to change and how much work it's going to take to get that done. And then, of course, it has to go to Shane, and he has to do all of the formatting and everything, and that's his own timetable, so that'll become another sort of, that's a moving target once we get that point done, but hopefully in the spring. So, all right, Chapter 11. There we go. Trem was brought up to his chambers to eat and drink, for Athor Einelmon had insisted he regain some of his strength before she showed him what she felt he must see. Having been assured the others were out of the manor, Athor dismissed all of her servants save one, who she tasked with carrying Trem to the very top of her home when he was finished eating. Though he could have fallen asleep then, Trem willed himself to remain awake so he could see what Keeper Athor was so determined to show him. The muscled servant picked him up with ease like a child and carried him up what seemed to be an unending number of steps. They reached a small, spiraling staircase at last, and the final climb led them to a round, ovular chamber, like the inside of an eggshell, where Athor Einelmon was waiting. The servant departed wordlessly, leaving Trem seated in the simple wooden chair Athor had brought up for him. The room was furnished with nothing else save a tall object at the center which was covered in a dark cloth. It appeared rounded just as the room was, like a full-length curving mirror, but Trem thought he heard a faint humming from it. Athor walked round it, muttering to herself in a rhythmic voice before coming to stand before him. She wore nothing on her shoulders save thin, tan stretches of cloth that covered her breasts and tied behind her at the small of her back, her waist bearing only a long loincloth of vibrant orange, and she was barefoot. She crouched down so as to be eye to eye with Trem and placed one hand on his leg. He noticed she wore no jewelry, though she had always been adorned with a great number of rings, earrings, and necklaces whenever he had seen her before. This room was once the place where the Weedkeepers summoned the Eversand to see the future. But at the last time, when we learned of the danger he posed to Yulinar, something happened we did not foresee. We were fortunate none of us were harmed, for Eversand makes the user less aware of the tangible dangers posed them in the physical world. She took a small tin from her pouch at her waist and held it towards Trem, removing the cap. Inside he could see very fine black and white grains, and a distinct odor of ash and a hint of flowers came from it. This is Eversand. Most who use it are only the highest regarded of the sages, but others have tried before. Not everyone can handle the effects. I thought it required a group of you to control the power. Athor laughed wonderfully and replaced the cover. Power? Eversand is not like magic, Trem Waterhound. It's a chemical that, when ingested, creates visions. Coupled with the proper rituals, it can allow one to see things that may be. And if you can't bear the effect? It's been known to drive some to madness and paranoia. Usually those symptoms dissipate in time. In time, Trem repeated skeptically. How long? For some it's hours, for others months. I'm not certain I want you to take the risk, Keeper. Athor laughed again. Oh, I won't be. You will. Trem's eyes grew incredibly wide. It's the only way, if you wish to see what things may come. And you must, for that's how you will understand yourself and what you will do. Do you know what I will see? Athor shook her head. I know only what I have seen, and for every person it's different. I will enact the ritual allowing you to harness the effects of the Eversand, but you will be the one who must control it and wield it. Trem shifted uncomfortably. But I'm injured and weak. Won't that make this more difficult? You have no choice. There are only 2 days for you to learn what you do not yet know. And tomorrow you will need to meet the gods in the most hallowed temple. It would be better if you had the gift of understanding, no matter how limited before that. Trem shook his head angrily. I'm not interested in speaking to the gods. They brought me nothing but pain and sadness. Whether you are interested or not, it's what you must do. Athor did not wait for him to respond, but stood and walked towards the shrouded object in the center of the room. She placed one hand on the dark cloth covering it and looked at him. What I am going to show you is something you may not speak of to anyone. For if my fellows knew it was still here and I had not destroyed it, they could seek to exile me, and those close to me, including Udo Ibvat Einelme and Wayna Einuari, who are not at fault in the matter. Trem nodded in agreement. Athor pulled the cloth, and it fell away from a curving iron frame with bars crossing it both horizontally and vertically to create a kind of cage. There was nothing in it, not at first, But then he saw that an image of the other side of the room, which he should be able to see clearly through the gaps in the bars, was shifting and twisting unnaturally. Suddenly a tear seemed to open up in the vision, and like a slow flame spreading across a piece of kindling, the tear widened, and soon there was a slit in the center of the cage, light-colored on the outside, rapidly transitioning to dark at the center. The tear changed colors from reds and blues and greens and purples to every pigment in between. To Trem it seemed like a great cat's eye shifting in form before him. There was a humming sound he had been dimly aware of before, but behind it he swore he heard voices whispering, talking over one another, though he could not make out anything they said. Athor Aion-Alman had walked slowly around and away from the cage until she was standing to Trem's left, about a foot closer to the portal than he was. She stared at it, and Trem saw on her face an expression he had not seen before: fear. She looked at that tear in front of them as though she were staring down her own death, then said, "This is a rift, a hole between our world and that from which the demonic comes. Perhaps you've read of them. They were prominent in the Arcane Wars." "Yes," Trem's voice betrayed its disbelief, "but why is it here now? There have not been reports of such things in my lifetime. We in Malaria have heard of some appearing of late, though our travelers could not confirm them. It's a sign, and one I do not think portends any good for us." She turned to look at him. "It appeared when we last used the Eversand, when we first learned of you and what you would do to the city of Yulinar if you came here. Many others took it as confirmation of the danger you pose, but I interpreted it differently. You see, the Eversand and the ritual do not reveal things clearly, despite what some of my fellow sages would claim. The visions must be studied, and even then the meaning may never be fully revealed. Those who wished you dead saw our doom coming, but in this," she gestured towards the rifts, turning to stare at it once more, "I saw our doom was already here." Trem looked from Athor to the always shifting opening, which seemed to have grown slightly as they were talking. He thought he saw things, indescribable things, moving in the tear. Athor stepped between him and the cage, breaking his line of sight, and he realized he'd been leaning forward, desperately trying to get closer. "You feel its pull, too. It almost consumed a number of us. If it remains long enough, I fear something will come through, hence why it is held in that cage. That iron is woven together with black steel, imbued with an immense amount of words from the arcane, and etched with glyphs of priests from every god that is known, and yet I fear it may not be enough." "So destroy it," Trem said, even as he felt a nagging sense in his mind to do such a thing would be wrong, somehow. "You said the others believed you had." "Perhaps I could. We know rift sweepers are in several locations around Southron, and they would come immediately if I called, and attempt to make their noble sacrifice to destroy it. But I do not wish to send for them. Not yet. I tell myself it is necessary to study the thing to understand it, but perhaps it is something else that stays my hand." Looking over her shoulder, Athor stared at the shimmering, shifting portal, then suddenly turned and walked towards it, hurling the heavy cloth over the cage. The humming quieted significantly, and the voices Trem swore he could hear ceased. Athor leaned on the frame of the iron for a moment before walking back towards him. "When covered, the rift closes. For now, I think it is safe." Trem looked at her, then back at the ominous object in the center of the room. "You said that to you, the appearance of the tear meant Yulinar was doomed regardless of my part in it. How could you be sure?" "I can't, but something made it open here when we sought to understand our future. The ritual is dangerous, not just because of the potency of the narcotic, but because of the prayers and strength of faith being called upon from so many immortals at once. We rarely enact it, but we felt driven by a desperate need and warnings from the priests tending to the temples across the city. Several gods sought to warn us of a threat, and we felt the need to make the ritual necessary. Some believe you are that danger, and I suspect it is this presence instead." Trem was quiet, deep in thought. He knew little of rifts, having heard only of rumor and legend that it was too fantastical or terrible to be believed. It seemed to him that Athor was taking a substantial risk, but it also eased his own conscience. Perhaps it wasn't he that would bring about the end of Yulinar, but he had to be sure. "You said I could use the Eversand to see what you saw. You can try, but what it shows you is not entirely up to me, nor can you fully direct visions. It will do what it wishes to do, and show what it wishes to show. Eversand has proven very useful in the past, but interpretation is always necessary. Sometimes you will not recognize the meaning of what is revealed until it occurs." Trem reached out his hand. "Give it to me. I'll try." Athor handed him the small tin and pulled from her hip a thin cylinder of bone. She placed it in the tin as Trem set the lid aside. "Put it up to your nose, and when you are ready, inhale." Sealing his other nostril, Trem set the bone straw and paused. Then he closed his eyes and breathed sharply and suddenly. The effect was physical at first, then seemed to veer into mental. He felt his head snap back and his eyes pop open. The light in the room and shifting rays on the walls seemed to brighten and dance. In his mind he heard waves and wind and fire all at once. Trem brought his head low, his hands gripping the arms of the chair as he lost his sense of place. He was no longer sitting, but floating and spinning, still aware of the room, but not feeling any stability within it. Athor's voice came through the chaos, and he fixated on it. "I will start the ritual. You will not understand my words, but allow the chant to carry you, and the Eversand will do the rest." Trem could not respond. It was impossible for him to even feel his body anymore. When he did try to sense his tongue or fingers or legs, it felt as though they were too large or too small, stretched in some way that should not have been. He gave up attempting to orient himself and his body. Hearing the rhythmic sounds of Athor's words at the swirling light and darkness, he hung on to them, their volume increasing and influence growing, until they were only the words, the noise, and nothing else. And there was a great cracking sound in his head, and he thought he was screaming, but the light swallowed everything. White was all around him. Then it seemed to shift, and a small hole appeared through which he could see things. First it was his companions before him, brief glimpses of each. Joven looking back at him through the white, older and with longer hair and a few scars he did not have now. Then Ghost, bent, crawling, and clutching the handle of something Trem could not make out. Next came Logan and Grimtooth, turning away, walking into darkness and disappearing. Diaga and Neep stood before him, expressionless, but tears coming from their eyes in steady rivulets. The stability of the vision gave way, and now he was above it, floating. He recognized Yulinar below, saw the buildings rising towards the center of the city, and some thick and terrible cloud gathering over the tallest tower, dark streaks of lightning crackling about it, and Trem felt fear he'd not felt before. Then he fell far and fast until he struck the ground, rising, and saw that he was not in Yulinar. He was on the wooden floor, disrupted unclear figures moving about him, but he saw two some distance away on a raised stage, one holding a stringed instrument, the other cloaked in black with his face covered, and Trem was certain it was Wrath. As they saw him, the scene winked out, and now he was staring at an innumerable mass of bodies covered in stained white cloth. He could not see who lay beneath them, but he knew it was people he had met, and that some of them were the ones he had seen in the visions before. Trem turned away in shame and fear, and the image broke like a pane of glass, falling away and taking him with it. He was on the battlements then. Unlike the other visions, this one felt more solid and more complete. Trem could look around him here, see the rounded corners, towers that keep behind, the town hugging the walls, and knew it was Aves. He knew it well, and he could feel the stone. Reaching deep, he tried to steady and hold on to the moment. He was alone. There was no one else around him, and though the fortress seemed empty of life, it did not reek of death or defeat. It was as though the place existed in limbo. Over the wall, he could see a massive wave coming. So far off, he could only recognize that it was moving like water. But as it closed with him, he saw that it was blood, an impossible amount of it. Gaining speed, it swallowed all the town and forest beyond the wall, and when it made contact with the stone, it buckled and fell. Trem went with it, and he could feel himself drowning. He was vomited onto a pile of ash and wood. Covered in red, dripping with crimson, he looked about himself to see wide swaths of nothing but charred mountains, forests, and the leavings of homes and other markers of civilization. Above him the sky was black, streaked with the same dark crackles of lightning he'd seen above Yulinar. Among them, enormous writhing tendrils moved, obscured blessedly by the clouds, and stretching forth to take the broken world below, and Trem knew he was seeing the end of all things. Then, in a flash of light, he saw eyeless, smiling faces full of fangs. He did not hear, but felt taunts all around mocking him for his weakness, his insecurity, and his foolish wish to be a hero. They closed on him from all sides, the massive beings aloft moving closer as well, and Trem searched desperately for an escape. Above him, on the faint cloud of pale mist, a figure in a black robe that flowed out from him to impossible lengths stared down. Trem reached for him, for his glowing platform, but the figure turned to look at him and whispered, "It is done." The horror exploded then, and Trem was certain he screamed this time, but he clung to the Eversand and sought out the rhythm of Athor Einelmann's chant to remind himself he was not here. It worked, and through the void he felt her voice and snatched it. On the wings of the chant he flew, and then he was on his feet, dressed in his clothes from his old home in Silverleaf, and standing in a garden so beautiful and vibrant that it took Trem some time to rein in his emotions. Fascinated with the sights of running water, trees, flowers, and all manner of animal life moving about him, he almost missed the voices. Relinquishing his tie to Athor's chant, he moved through the hedges of the garden towards what sounded like two women talking. As he came to the center, where a beautiful fountain was shooting brilliant blue water into the air, he saw them. The first he recognized immediately from his years of reading the histories of immortals over and over, Alanormir, the goddess of life. The other he did not fully remember, but she had dark hair where Alanormir's was brilliant and golden, and she wore dark blue robes where Alanormir's were shimmering silvery white. The contrast was powerful, but something in the eyes of the other, for Alanormir's back was to Trem, gave him pause. Her face was a mask, expressionless and empty, and it seemed she was weighing the character of her better, and not the other way around. This time Trem could hear the words clearly. Alanormir shifted uncomfortably, saying, "I am glad you understand." "But you do not," the other interrupted, turning her long stare onto Trem as though she knew he was there. "This does not end it. They will still believe in us, and someday they will learn how to bring us to their world. You think you can sever our bond to those we made and keep our kind out of Teth-Tanir, but you can only cut it, and it will heal. What else am I supposed to do, Naratha?" Alanormir clenched her fists and turned her back on the other, who Trem now recognized as the goddess of fate. Tears streamed down Alanormir's face, which was contorted in a mask of doubt and fear. "Everything we made is going to be destroyed." Naratha looked out over the garden. "Who is to say that's not also inevitable? You're the goddess of life. You revel in the experience of living, growing older and wiser, and you fear, as we all do, what comes at the end. But there is an end, eventually, for everything." She smiled, a tight-lipped but genuine gesture, extending one hand to allow a large butterfly to land on her fingers. Many, mortal and immortal, do not realize that all things converge, but that is what fate is, an eventuality, an ending. Eleanor wiped her eyes and seemed to Trem to steel herself, digging deep to find her conviction. Then, if that is so, the ending should be the one mortals choose, not the one that is chosen for them, as Narath would have it be. As the butterfly left her hand, Naratha turned to Eleanormir, her eyes deep with sadness. You should cease lying to yourself. The goddess of life spun then, and Trem saw as she did a fearsome rage he would not have thought possible from her, and its alien nature on her bright and caring face disturbed him more than the dark visions from before. Naratha did not seem affected. Do it now. I'm ready. Eleanor hesitated, her hands at her sides. Trem felt a growing unease that sprouted into true premonition of doom. Eleanor closed her eyes, clenching and unclenching her fists again and again, her face contorted in a way that belied her internal turmoil. Then, her hands came up suddenly as if controlled by some outside force, and she turned, extending one hand, fingers splayed, toward her fellow immortal. Naratha's eyes closed as Eleanor concentrated all of her power and will on the goddess and pulled her very being apart. It was slow at first, and then sudden. Naratha stretched, and pieces of her seemed to crack and fall free. Then she was 100 pieces, 1,000, 1,000,000, and then an innumerable amount of bright specks of power around a thrumming light, and then she was nothing. Trem gasped in shock, and the image winked out. He thought at first that it was over, but a cascade of other visions came then. Trem was spinning, dizzy, disoriented, and he tried to take in what whirled about him. There was a yawning cavern opening, a tall and smooth series of columns all around, clouds swirling about him, and alien structures of shining metal and glass. At last he was standing before a pool, a tall figure behind him with a hand on his shoulder, and the steady sound of leathery wings in the distance. He knew he had to move towards the sound, and he was afraid. As he stepped forward, the pool changing to a path worn by many boots before his, Narath appeared before him. An army of mortals from across Tethtanir arrayed behind, and pointed over Trem's shoulder. He turned to see the writhing monsters of the dark sky and the fanged shades from before. The unspoken question clamored in Trem's mind. Would he turn and meet the being he could not hear past Narath, or would he take the god of death's hand and face what was coming? Ghost would never have admitted to growing bored, preferring instead to hide his mundane state with assertions of impatience to be about his grander business, but bored he was. The oasis offered little for him to do, other than ensuring water and food were available to the refugees, and the watchers made certain of that for him more often than not. Before long he was left with a great deal of free time and no books to read, for most of the other foreigners were unwilling to lend or trade him their texts, and those who were asked incredible prices for them. In place of sitting around, sweating and frustrated, Ghost decided to engage the men of Delmore in martial training. He garnered most of his attention and interest from the youth, and soon he had almost 30 willing trainees, from age 3 to 30, armed with whatever mock weapons or lingering cast-offs from the siege of Delmore were at hand. Among them were Caliandra's wards, Nawandel and Samuel, who were both rather afraid of Ghost with his shaggy beard, stern voice, and perpetual glare. However, the boys were eager to learn, both wanting to be able to protect themselves and their friends from future horrors. Ghost made no attempt to hide his lessons from parents or guardians. He would rouse his students in the morning and have them perform basic physical training before the heat was too severe. In the afternoon, he had them work on forms and stances so as not to exhaust them in the sun. Evenings were dedicated to sparring, mostly shadowed, but occasionally he would allow some of the older boys to scrap with one another. He was always careful to step in and teach a particularly confident fighter a lesson. Despite his age, Ghost remained an excellent warrior even with an improvised weapon. He soundly knocked about all of his students when needed, and what began as a sense of fear and doubt among them soon turned into something like trust and appreciation. Ghost was a harsh teacher, but he was a good one. Samuel had taken up something of a leadership position among the boys. He was only barely 5.5, but he was strong and child and full of determination. Ghost had taken to him immediately and found he was very good with bracing himself and setting his feet. In short order, Ghost had gifted him a makeshift shield and was teaching him how to fight defensively, using his natural tendencies to his advantage. Nawandel, whom Ghost had expected little from at first, was proving remarkably gifted in a different way. Agile and focused, he could dance around any opponent he faced, even those much larger and with a longer reach than himself, and keep them at bay with his spear. Soon Ghost had them taking 4 pupils each, all the youngest children, and working with them in different ways. This freed him to take the elder students, as he could trust the 2 boys to do precisely what he asked with their charges. The first 2 days had gone smoothly, and the 3rd day had helped things settle into a rhythm. Ghost hoped Trem and Joven would return with the others soon, but he had no idea how long it might take. This spared him counting the hours, and it was a good way to channel his need to command in some small way. Logan caught wind of the training sessions in short order and confronted Ghost with accusations of manipulating the youth into learning to fight, especially those the Angudek felt were too young to be engaging in such adult activity. Ghost's answer was simple and to the point. When did you start sparring? I doubt it was later than your 5th year. That boy, Logan gestured in exasperation towards Samuel, was sucking his thumb and clinging to a stuffed bear when we found him in Delmore. That was barely months ago. I'd wager if you asked Samuel, he would say it would feel like a lifetime. Logan had no response to that, and he was further frustrated by Grimtooth's unexpected support for Ghost's work. The orc pointed out that in the orc holds, his people were taught to wrestle and fight from birth. Orcs value martial skill and mastery over all else, and thus he believed Ghost was giving the children and young men a way to channel the hurt and trauma of Delmore into something they could use. Moreover, the parents were into a one supportive, and by the third day several asked to join. Ghost was happy to take them, though at a loss as to how he would teach them all, even with some of his faster learners helping. This was solved when Grimtooth came to the afternoon lesson and offered his services. Between them, they were able to assist anyone who wanted to start understanding how to defend themselves. Logan kept himself apart from the whole proceeding. He still felt a deep and defiant sense of dislike for Ghost. He admitted, at least to himself, that he would probably never be able to come to grips with his distaste for what Ghost had done to his country. Redemption, such an important part of Logan's own identity in his life in Angudeus, seemed to be something he could not extend to another whose stark and cold view of the world was in contrast to Logan's own. It was not that he could not understand why Ghost felt the way that he did about war or the application of logic to situations like they had encountered in Delmore. It was that Logan had to believe strongly in the nobility of action. Without causes, without justice, what was the purpose in the night being so far from home now? Of course he knew the truth. He'd sinned and violated the tenets of the code. Regardless of what he would claim, that he loved Lena Engrove and would for all his life, he had laid with her out of wedlock and been discovered. His brother could have hidden his secret and allowed him to remain in Angudeus, but instead he had used it to push Logan on the same path Varasho himself had walked. Varasho had always wanted to be a paladin, the epitome of their nation's faith and righteousness. Logan had not, but he knew his brother wanted him to embrace the role as fervently as Varasho had. So here he was, far from home and bitter, perhaps more at the freedom Ghost took from following his own sense of right and wrong, as opposed to Logan's iconic view of it. Logan might have sought out other refugees for company or talked to some of the travelers near the oasis, but there was little for him to share with them. He did find time to speak with Wrath occasionally when the Watcher was able and willing to speak with him. Wrath had taken, or been given, the task of overseeing the care of the refugees. He directed others of his order to supply food and water, and he led most of the scouting forays around the oasis. Logan once caught him while the two were sharing some water and asked what the Watchers did with those they found in the endless sands. Wrath's response was curt and direct. Nothing. If they are dead, we may take some items from the bodies. If they live, we will approach them, if they appear to be of noble purpose. Otherwise, we leave them alone. But aren't you supposed to protect the Dominion? The Dominion protects itself, Knight. Only those who know the sands can survive here. And if we encounter those that do not appear to have ill intent, that do appear to have ill intent, we make short work of them. That seemed to settle the matter, and Logan felt there was little chance to delve further. Wrath did not linger, he never did, and soon the knight was left alone once more. He sipped his water and looked out at the haggard retinues of those seeking the knowledge of the Malarians, biding their time in perpetuity, and sat down under a broadleaf palm to wait for one more day to pass, hoping the others would return soon and give him a purpose once more. In the Inn of the Four Winds, Mara set a large platter of bread and cheese out with a dozen flagons of ale and whistled. The crowd of soldiers, some of the officer corps, turned and whooped that the latest round was served up. Mara waited impatiently for them to come, but the leader, a youngish man with the start of a beard, waved her over. She threw her dish rag down in disgust and turned her back. There was a crowd in the establishment, and not a one of them was a resident of Guayaquil. It was bad enough they had forced her open. Worse still that when she had refused to employ the waitresses she had used before the town was sacked, and Mara knew she was probably only a few more slights away from being a victim herself. She turned back round, drawing a mug, and the officer was there, both hands on the bar. "Listen, you bitch. If I wave you over, you come over. Wouldn't want anything to happen to you or your place, would we?" Mara didn't bat an eye. "As though you'd burned down your only source of ale. Leave me alone." "Hey!" His hand shot across the table and grabbed her elbow. "You can still serve us if I break one arm." The sound of a blade cutting through the air and coming, wobbling, to a halt against the man's throat put a stop to the exchange. Melissa's sword wavered unsteadily, and she pressed a good bit harder against his neck than she intended, drawing some deal of blood. Still, his hand had fallen away from Mara, and he was backing away, though she refused to let the metal leave his skin. Melissa took a gulp of her own ale, not even looking at the officer, and said, "Take your food and drink back to your table, and don't come up here again." The officer slunk away, one hand balancing the tray while the other pressed against his bleeding throat. The revelry from that corner of their common room was dulled significantly, but the hum of laughter and drunken banter returned elsewhere before long. The sword mistress took a massive pull from her tankard and held her mug out. "Another, please." Mara looked at her a moment, then took the mug and set it against the tap to refill it. As she was handing it back, Melissa paused before accepting it, and said, "My apologies for the behavior of the rabble." "They are your rabble. An apology will not be enough." Melissa snatched the cup, spilling a decent amount of her drink, and took a long pull. She slammed it down and said through gritted teeth, "I'm not the one who turned your girls over to that savage, nor am I the person who agreed to such a disgusting demand." "No, you're not. You also never tried to stop it." Felissa shot her a baleful look. "If you were a soldier, I'd have cut some sense into you by now." Mara stopped at her work, turned, and leaned her heavy arms on the bar. "Well, I'm not a soldier. None of us are. But if it had been up to me, we'd have fought you and those beasts you command until every last one of us was dead." She could not hold back tears in her eyes, so she turned away. "It's better than what's become of us now." Felissa did not have a response to that. She looked down at her cup, still half full of ale, and studied it for a while. Then angrily, she shoved back from the bar, nearly falling over in her drunken stupor, and stumbled out the front door of the inn. The cold hit her hard, and she remembered she had left her cloak in her makeshift quarters in the southwestern tower of Guayaquil. She walked unsteadily down the stairs, her mind slightly sharper from the cold, but still swirling in drink, and looked up and down the road. It had been choked with people when the broken first arrived. Now there was hardly a one in sight. Kicking a loose stone in frustration, she began to walk back to her base of operations. About halfway, she cut through a narrow alley, expecting it to bring her back a bit sooner, since it was quite cold at that point. As she was walking unsteadily towards a small intersection, she caught movement around one corner of her eye. Even intoxicated, she reacted swiftly. Shoving aside a sackcloth cover, she revealed several starving and huddled people in a broken cart, trying their best to stay warm amid the hay inside it. None of them were armed, being refugees almost certainly, and one had the ears of an elf. Through her bleary eyes, she watched them, confusion on her face. The youngest, a boy of about 10, blurted out, "Please, miss, please, don't bring us to the dogs." Felissa took a moment to understand what he was saying, as the older occupants of the cart tried to stifle him. Dogs? What dogs? That seemed to ignite an involuntary anger in the elf. "The gnolls, he means. You've been snatching people off the street and feeding them to the gnolls. We've seen it." His eyes, sunken with lack of sleep and hunger, burned fiercely. "Well, if you want to take us, I won't sit by and let you. You'll have to kill me first." Felissa looked at him with a mixture of disbelief and confusion. Then she released the raggedy tarp and began walking away. The group peered out at her in stunned silence, then proceeded to try making their hiding place more difficult to see. Felissa turned the corner, and in a few minutes she was at the tower. One of her Napoleon men was on guard and saluted her. She paused, swaying slightly, and asked, "Have you heard anything about people being fed to gnolls?" The soldier looked at her, unsure of how to respond, but the flash of anger in her eyes that his delay caused made him answer quickly. "Yes, my lady. Gornath has sent units to both outside the walls and within hunting for refugees. His men told me they had to keep the gnolls sated so they didn't overrun the camp." Felissa scowled in fury and stormed past him. She entered the tower and swept through her guards to her room at the back. Shutting the door behind her, she leaned against it a moment, trying to contain herself. When she could not, she flew into such a rage she tore apart her quarters, tearing down banners and smashing furniture. When she had wrecked most of the room, she stopped, breathing heavily, and went back to the door. Pushing it open, she glanced about the main entrance of the tower, where a number of her men and women were pretending not to have heard her destructive tirade. Seeing one of the first recruits she'd named to her banner, she waved him over. The Napoleon came without hesitation, but his face made it clear he would have rather been just about anywhere else at that moment. Felissa waited for him to salute. Then she said in a calm and clear voice, "I want you to take 60 men, in 3 groups of 20, and secure barriers in our quarter of the town. No other soldiers are to enter, not even from our own army, under any circumstances." "What about civilians, sword mistress?" "Admit as many as you can, and see if we can get more rations distributed to them. People out there are starving, and there's no reason for it." She knew that the last statement was a lie, supplies were thin, but she doubted her men would question her. The soldier did indeed bow, and immediately go to carry out her orders. Allowing herself to be mildly satisfied, Felissa scanned the room for any signs of dissent, happy to see there was none. Saying that she was going to be in poor spirits when she woke, Felissa hastened to her room to sleep, despite the fact it was only mid-afternoon. Alright, so that's chapter 11. I'll be back a little later today. I'm not sure what time, but I'll put up a tweet on about, we'll say 5 minutes before it launches, and we'll have chapter 12 coming in. Thanks.